Picture this. You're walking past your boss's office at 9 p.m., thinking you're alone in the building, when you hear him on a phone call planning your workplace accident. Not just any accident. He's literally discussing how to make you slip on a conveniently wet floor during tomorrow's big client presentation. The same presentation that could make or break your career. Well, that's exactly what happened to me 3 months ago. And what I did next turned his entire world upside down. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The fluorescent lights in the Meridian Marketing Building always gave me a headache after 8 p.m., but I'd gotten used to working late. As a senior account manager, I was used to putting in the extra hours, especially with the Morrison Industries account presentation looming the next morning. This wasn't just any client. Morrison Industries was a $50 million contract that could single-handedly secure our agency's future for the next 5 years. I'd been preparing for this presentation for 3 months. Every slide, every transition, every backup plan had been meticulously crafted. My team and I had pulled countless late nights, analyzed market data until our eyes bled, and created what I genuinely believed was the most comprehensive marketing strategy our agency had ever produced. The presentation was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp, and I wanted everything perfect. That Tuesday evening, I was making my final rounds through the office, double-checking that all the presentation materials were loaded correctly on the conference room computer. The building was eerily quiet. Most of my colleagues had left by 6 p.m., and even the cleaning crew had finished their rounds. The only sounds were the hum of the air conditioning and the distant rumble of traffic from downtown Seattle. My boss, Richard Kellerman, had his office on the 3rd floor, while the rest of our team worked on the 2nd. Richard was one of those middle managers who seemed to have mastered the art of taking credit for other people's work, while somehow avoiding any real responsibility when things went wrong. He'd been with Meridian for 12 years, working his way up from a junior position, and had developed a reputation for being ruthlessly ambitious. Most of us had learned to navigate around his ego, but lately, I'd noticed him becoming increasingly territorial about the Morrison account. 3 weeks earlier, Richard had started making subtle comments about my leadership style during team meetings. Nothing overt, just small jabs about my aggressive approach with clients or questions about whether I was really ready for this level of responsibility. At first, I'd brushed it off as typical office politics, but the comments had become more frequent and more pointed. The real red flag came 2 weeks ago when I discovered that Richard had been having private meetings with Morrison Industries' CEO, James Morrison, without including me or my team. When I asked him about it, he claimed they were just relationship-building conversations, and that he didn't want to overwhelm Morrison with too many point people. But something about his explanation felt off. Richard had never shown interest in building client relationships before. That was always left to the account managers. As I walked past the 3rd floor elevator bay that evening, heading toward the stairs, I heard Richard's voice echoing from his partially open office door. He was clearly on a phone call, and his tone was different from his usual professional demeanor, more conspiratorial, almost excited. Something made me pause. "Tomorrow morning, right before the presentation starts," Richard was saying, "the maintenance guys are going to be doing some cleaning in the hallway outside the conference room. Nothing unusual about that. Happens all the time." I moved closer to the wall, staying out of sight. My heart started beating faster, though I couldn't quite articulate why. "Jessica always gets to the office early for big presentations," Richard continued. "She'll be rushing around, probably carrying a stack of materials, not paying attention to where she's walking. All it takes is one slippery spot in the right location. Jessica." That was me. Jessica Martinez, Senior Account Manager, the person who'd spent 3 months preparing for tomorrow's presentation. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to process what I was hearing. "Look, I know it sounds elaborate, but this needs to look completely natural." Richard's voice carried clearly through the quiet hallway. "An unfortunate accident, right before the biggest presentation of the year. She gets hurt, can't present, and I have to step in to save the day. Morrison Industries gets their presentation from someone with 12 years of experience, instead of someone who's only been in the senior role for 18 months. The blood drained from my face. He was talking about sabotaging me, actually planning to have me injured so he could take over my presentation. The floor will be genuinely wet. I've already arranged for the cleaning crew to mop that specific area around 9:45 a.m. Jessica usually arrives between 9:15 and 9:30, so the timing works perfectly. She'll come around that corner by the conference room, probably moving fast because she's always rushing and… Richard paused and I could hear him chuckling. Well, gravity does the rest. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just office politics or professional jealousy. This was premeditated sabotage that could result in serious injury. Richard was literally planning to have me hurt so he could steal my work and present it as his own to the most important client our agency had ever pursued. The beauty of it is that everyone knows Jessica's a workaholic who rushes around the office, Richard continued. No one will question that she simply slipped on a wet floor. Accidents happen. Meanwhile, I'll be the hero who steps up in a crisis situation and delivers a flawless presentation. Morrison Industries will be impressed by my leadership under pressure, and the agency will realize they need someone more experienced handling accounts of this magnitude. My hands were shaking as I listened. 3 months of work. 3 months of late nights, weekend planning sessions, market research, client interviews, and strategic development. All of it was about to be stolen by a man who was willing to physically harm me to advance his career. Trust me, Sarah, this is the only way, Richard said, and I realized he was talking to someone named Sarah. I've been passed over for the regional director position twice, because they keep promoting these younger account managers who don't have the institutional knowledge. This Morrison contract could change everything. Once I land this account, they'll have to recognize my value to the company. Sarah, I racked my brain trying to figure out who that could be. The only Sarah I knew in our building was Sarah Chen, the facilities coordinator who managed building maintenance and cleaning schedules. If Richard had gotten Sarah involved in this scheme, it meant he'd been planning this for a while and had accomplices. I know you're taking a risk by adjusting the cleaning schedule, Richard continued, but I promise you won't regret this. When I get promoted to regional director, I'll make sure you get that facilities manager position you've been wanting. This is a win-win situation for both of us. So that was it. Richard was bribing Sarah with a promotion in exchange for her help in sabotaging me. The scope of this conspiracy was bigger than I'd initially realized. Just make sure the floor is properly wet around 9:45 a.m. sharp, Richard said. Not soaking. That would look suspicious, but slippery enough to guarantee a fall. And make sure you're nowhere near the area when it happens. You were in your office doing paperwork, completely unaware of any cleaning activities in that part of the building. I heard the sound of Richard's chair creaking, indicating he was probably leaning back, pleased with his plan. Tomorrow is going to be a very interesting day, he said with satisfaction. By noon, I'll be the hero who saved the Morrison Industries presentation, and Jessica will be dealing with the consequences of being careless around wet floors. Sometimes the best career moves require a little creativity. The call ended, and I heard Richard moving around his office. I quickly but quietly made my way to the stairwell, my mind racing with everything I'd just overheard. As I descended to the second floor, I tried to process the full magnitude of what Richard was planning. This wasn't just about stealing credit for my work, though that was bad enough. He was planning to cause me physical harm. A slip on a wet floor might sound minor, but people broke bones, suffered concussions, or worse from falls like that. And he was doing it all so he could swoop in and present my work as his own to the most important client in our agency's history. Back at my desk, I sat in the dark for nearly an hour, trying to figure out what to do. My first instinct was to call the police, but what crime had actually been committed? Richard and Sarah had discussed a plan, but they hadn't acted on it yet. Would the police even take this seriously, or would they dismiss it as workplace drama? I could go to HR, but our HR department consisted of exactly one person, Linda Walsh, who reported directly to the executive team. If I made accusations against Richard without concrete proof, it would be my word against his. Richard had been with the company for 12 years and had built relationships throughout the organization. I'd been in my senior role for less than 2 years. Who would they believe? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that simply preventing Richard's plan wasn't enough. Even if I managed to avoid the accident tomorrow, he would just find another way to undermine me. The Morrison Industries presentation was too important to him, And he'd already shown he was willing to cause me physical harm to get what he wanted. No, I needed to do more than just protect myself. I needed to expose Richard for what he really was and make sure he faced consequences for his actions. The question was how to do it in a way that would be both effective and irrefutable. Hub on tough. Preacher Mikey de Shasura Ishef, Betasas Hakrits made it in Fretzerapos. Our office building had been upgraded with a comprehensive security camera system 6 months earlier. There were cameras in all the hallways, including the corridor outside the conference room where Richard was planning to have me slip. If I could somehow document what was about to happen, or better yet, catch Richard in the act of setting up his sabotage, I might have the evidence I needed to not only protect myself, but to end his career. I spent the rest of that evening developing my own plan. If Richard wanted to play games, I was going to make sure I won. But I had to be smart about it. One wrong move, and I could end up seriously injured or, worse, unemployed, with a reputation for making false accusations against my supervisor. By the time I left the office that night, I had a strategy. It was risky, it required perfect timing, and it depended on several factors beyond my control. But if it worked, Richard Kellerman was about to learn that some people fight back when you try to destroy their careers. The next morning was going to be very interesting indeed. I arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m. the next morning, 3 hours earlier than usual. The building was completely empty except for the security guard, Marcus, who gave me a surprised look as I badged in through the main entrance. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "You're here mighty early, Miss Martinez," Marcus said, looking up from his crossword puzzle. "Big day today?" "The biggest," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just want to make sure everything's perfect for our presentation." What Marcus didn't know was that I'd spent most of the night awake, refining my plan. I'd identified 3 critical elements I needed to execute perfectly: documentation, timing, and witnesses. If any one of these failed, Richard would not only get away with his sabotage attempt, but I'd likely find myself unemployed and possibly facing legal action for false accusations. The first step was gaining access to the building's security system. Our IT department had installed the new camera network throughout the building, but the monitoring station was located in the basement security office. I needed to understand exactly which cameras covered the hallway outside the conference room and, more importantly, how to access the footage if something happened. I made my way down to the basement level, which housed the building's mechanical systems, storage areas, and the security office. The hallway was dimly lit, with that typical basement smell of concrete and recycled air. Marcus's security station was a small room filled with multiple monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the building. "Marcus," I called out as I approached his office, "I hate to bother you, but I'm wondering if you could help me with something." He looked up from his desk where he'd been reviewing some paperwork. "Sure thing, Ms. Martinez. What can I do for you? I'm expecting some very important clients today for our big presentation, and I want to make sure everything goes smoothly. Would it be possible to review the camera coverage for the 3rd floor, particularly around the conference room area? I just want to understand the layout in case there are any security concerns." Marcus was a former police officer who'd taken the security job after retiring from the Seattle Police Department. He was thorough, professional, and took his responsibilities seriously. More importantly, he'd always been friendly with the employees and seemed to genuinely care about building security. "Of course," he said, turning to his bank of monitors. "Let me show you the camera coverage for that area." He pulled up a schematic of the building's 3rd floor on his computer screen. The conference room was located at the end of a long hallway, with cameras positioned at 3 strategic points: one at the elevator bank, one halfway down the hallway, and one directly outside the conference room entrance. "These cameras record continuously," Marcus explained, pointing to each location on the screen. "We keep the footage for 30 days before it gets automatically deleted." The camera right outside the conference room has excellent coverage of the entire entrance area, including the hallway intersection where people typically approach from the elevator or stairwell. Perfect. The intersection Marcus was describing was exactly where Richard had planned for me to slip. If I could somehow get Richard to reveal his plan or catch him in the act of setting up the sabotage, it would all be captured on camera. "That's very thorough," I said. What's the procedure if something happens and we need to review footage? Well, normally that would go through HR or executive management, Marcus replied. But if there's an incident, like someone getting hurt, I can pull the footage immediately for review. Safety incidents take priority over normal protocols. The wheels were turning in my head. Marcus had just given me crucial information about how to access the security footage if my plan worked. EO. I really appreciate this, Marcus. One more question. When you're monitoring the cameras, do you typically watch them in real time, or do you mostly review footage after incidents occur? Bit of both, he said. During busy hours, like when everyone's arriving in the morning, I keep an eye on the live feeds. But I also spend time reviewing footage from the previous day, looking for anything unusual. Why do you ask? Just curious about the process. Thanks for explaining everything to me. I left Marcus's office with a much clearer understanding of how the security system worked. Now I needed to move on to the second phase of my plan, setting up my own surveillance. Back on the second floor, I went to my desk and retrieved a small digital recorder I'd purchased on my way to work that morning. It was one of those tiny devices designed for students to record lectures, barely larger than a USB drive, but capable of recording high-quality audio for up to 8 hours. I'd also stopped at an electronics store and bought a small wireless camera designed for home security monitoring. It wasn't professional-grade equipment, but it would be enough to capture what I needed. The tricky part was positioning these devices where they could capture Richard's activities without being discovered. I needed to think like Richard. Where would he go to set up his sabotage? And how could I document it without tipping him off? I made my way up to the third floor, moving quietly through the hallways. The conference room where our presentation was scheduled was located at the end of a corridor that intersected with the main hallway near the elevator bank. There was a small alcove across from the conference room entrance that housed a water fountain and some decorative plants. If I could position my camera in that alcove, it would have a clear view of the area where Richard planned to create his accident. Working quickly, I secured the small camera behind one of the larger plants, angling it to capture the hallway intersection. The device was so small and well hidden that someone would have to be specifically looking for it to notice it. I activated the camera using my smartphone app and confirmed that it was recording with a clear view of the target area. Next, I needed to figure out how to capture Richard's conversation with Sarah Chen about the final details of their plan. Based on what I'd overheard the night before, they would likely need to coordinate the timing of the cleaning crew's activities. Sarah's office was on the first floor, near the main reception area, but Richard would probably want to discuss the details privately. I decided to take a calculated risk. Richard usually arrived at the office around 8:30 a.m., and Sarah typically got in around 8 a.m. If they were going to finalize their plan, it would probably happen shortly after Richard arrived. I positioned myself in the first floor break room, which was adjacent to Sarah's office, and placed my digital recorder on the windowsill that separated the two spaces. The recorder was small enough to be mistaken for a phone charger, and the windowsill was cluttered with various office supplies that provided good camouflage. By 8:15 a.m., I was back at my desk on the second floor, pretending to work on last-minute presentation materials while actually monitoring the building's activities through the windows. I watched as Sarah arrived and went to her office, followed about 20 minutes later by Richard, who headed straight for the elevator. Around 8:45 a.m., I saw Richard exit the elevator on the first floor and walk purposefully toward Sarah's office. This was it. If they were going to discuss the final details of their plan, it would be now. I forced myself to wait 10 minutes before casually walking to the break room to get coffee. As I approached the area, I could hear voices coming from Sarah's office, but the conversation was too muffled to make out specific words. However, my digital recorder was positioned perfectly to capture everything. I spent about 5 minutes in the break room, making coffee and trying to look natural while listening to any changes in the conversation next door. Finally, I heard Richard's voice getting louder, indicating he was probably preparing to leave. "Remember, 9:45 a.m. exactly," Richard was saying. "The cleaning crew finishes that area, and then you make sure they're gone before Jessica arrives. We want the floor wet, but no witnesses to the cleaning activity." "I understand," Sarah replied. "The hallway will be slippery enough to guarantee a fall, but it'll look like a simple accident. And you're sure about the timing?" Jessica always gets here between 9:15 and 9:30 for important presentations. She'll be carrying materials, probably moving fast, and she always takes that route from the elevator to the conference room. Physics will do the rest. I heard the sound of a chair moving, indicating Richard was standing up to leave. After she falls, I'll be the concerned supervisor who immediately steps up to handle the presentation. Morrison Industries will be impressed by my crisis management skills, and Jessica will be dealing with injuries that conveniently remove her from the picture. What if she's not hurt badly enough to miss the presentation? Sarah asked. Trust me, the way I've planned this, she'll be lucky if she doesn't break something. But even if she's just shaken up and bruised, she won't be in any condition to deliver a high-stakes presentation to a $50 million client. I'll position myself as the only person capable of salvaging the situation. Perfect. I had everything I needed on the recorder. Richard explicitly describing his plan to cause me injury, Sarah acknowledging her role in the conspiracy, and both of them discussing the deliberate nature of what they were planning. This wasn't a casual conversation about workplace competition. This was a detailed discussion of premeditated sabotage. I quickly retrieved my recorder and headed back to my desk, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I now had audio evidence of the conspiracy, and my hidden camera was positioned to capture the actual sabotage attempt, but the most critical part of my plan was still ahead. I needed to make sure that when Richard's trap was sprung, I wouldn't be the one caught in it. More importantly, I needed to ensure that Richard's actions were witnessed by people who could serve as credible witnesses to his misconduct. I spent the next hour making phone calls and sending emails, carefully orchestrating the final phase of my counterplan. First, I called Morrison Industries and spoke directly with James Morrison's executive assistant. Hi, this is Jessica Martinez from Meridian Marketing, I said. I wanted to confirm the logistics for this morning's presentation. I know Mr. Morrison is planning to arrive at 10 a.m., but I was wondering if he might be available to arrive 15 minutes early. We've prepared some additional materials that I think he'll find very interesting, and the extra time would allow us to walk through everything more thoroughly. The assistant checked Morrison's schedule and confirmed that he could arrive at 9:45 a.m. instead of 10 a.m. Perfect. That would put him in the building exactly when Richard and Sarah were planning to execute their sabotage. Next, I called our agency's CEO, Patricia Hammond, who I knew was particularly interested in the Morrison Industries account. Patricia, this is Jessica Martinez. I know you're planning to attend this morning's presentation, but I was wondering if you might have time to arrive a few minutes early. I'd love to give you a quick preview of some of the key points before Mr. Morrison arrives. Patricia was enthusiastic about the idea and agreed to come to the office by 9:40 a.m. Finally, I called Marcus in the security office. Marcus, this is Jessica Martinez again. I wanted to give you a heads up that we're expecting some very important visitors this morning between 9:45 and 10 a.m. Would it be possible for you to personally escort Mr. Morrison from Morrison Industries up to the 3rd floor when he arrives? I want to make sure he gets the VIP treatment. Marcus was happy to accommodate the request and said he'd be watching for Morrison's arrival. By 9:30 a.m., all the pieces were in place. Richard and Sarah believed they were about to execute a perfect plan to sabotage my presentation and advance Richard's career. What they didn't know was that I'd turned their trap into a stage where their conspiracy would be exposed in front of the most important witnesses possible. I gathered my presentation materials and headed for the 3rd floor, my pulse quickening as I approached the moment of truth. In 15 minutes, Richard Kellerman was about to learn that some people fight back when you try to destroy their lives, and this fight was going to end his career permanently. At 9:35 a.m., I positioned myself in the 2nd floor break room with a clear view of the elevator bank. My hands were trembling slightly as I watched the building's morning routine unfold. Employees were arriving for the day, unaware that they were about to witness the most dramatic workplace confrontation in Meridian Marketing's history. Through the window, I saw Patricia Hammond's black Mercedes pull into the executive parking area. She stepped out wearing her signature navy blue power suit, briefcase in hand, looking every inch the successful CEO who'd built this agency from the ground up over 15 years. Patricia had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting the company's interests and reputation. My phone buzzed with a text from Morrison Industries' assistant. Mr. Morrison is 5 minutes out. Should arrive at 9:45 as requested. Perfect timing. I watched as Patricia entered the building and headed for the elevator. According to my plan, she would go directly to the third floor to meet me for our preview discussion. What she would find instead was about to change everything. From my vantage point, I could see Richard emerging from his office on the third floor, checking his watch. He appeared calm and confident, probably running through his mental checklist of how the next few minutes would unfold. He expected to see me slip and fall, then swoop in as the hero who saved the presentation. At 9:42 a.m., I saw Sarah Chen walking quickly toward the elevator, carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of focused expression that suggested she was about to execute an important task. She was heading up to coordinate the final phase of their plan. I grabbed my presentation materials and headed for the stairwell, taking the steps two at a time. I needed to be in position to witness what happened next, but I also needed to stay far enough away to avoid becoming a victim of the sabotage I'd helped orchestrate. As I reached the third floor, I could hear the elevator arriving. The doors opened, and Patricia stepped out, followed moments later by Marcus, who was clearly preparing for Morrison's arrival. Patricia looked around, probably expecting to see me waiting for her. "Marcus, have you seen Jessica Martinez this morning?" Patricia asked. "Yes, ma'am. She was here very early, around 6:30. She mentioned wanting everything perfect for the big presentation." At that moment, the elevator doors opened again, and James Morrison stepped out. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 60s, wearing an expensive charcoal gray suit and carrying a leather portfolio. Morrison Industries was his company, built from a small manufacturing operation into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, and he had the presence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Mr. Morrison, welcome to Meridian Marketing," Patricia said, immediately switching into executive mode. "I'm Patricia Hammond, CEO. Jessica Martinez should be here shortly to begin your presentation." "Actually," Morrison replied, "I was hoping to arrive a few minutes early. Jessica called and mentioned some additional materials she wanted to review." Marcus stepped forward. "I'll escort you to the conference room, Mr. Morrison. Ms. Martinez specifically asked me to make sure you received VIP treatment." As the group moved down the hallway toward the conference room, I positioned myself near the stairwell entrance, where I could observe without being seen. My hidden camera was recording everything, and I could see that the intersection near the conference room was exactly as I'd left it earlier. That's when I noticed Sarah Chen emerging from the facilities closet, pushing a mop bucket. She was moving quickly and efficiently, heading directly for the area outside the conference room. The timing was perfect. She was executing the plan exactly as Richard had outlined. Sarah began mopping the floor in the intersection area, creating a slick surface that would be nearly invisible to someone walking quickly around the corner. She worked systematically, ensuring the floor was wet enough to cause a serious slip, but not so obviously flooded that it would look suspicious. As Sarah worked, Richard appeared from his office, walking casually toward the conference room area. He was positioning himself to have a clear view of the trap while maintaining plausible deniability about his involvement. Bafamachas. That's when everything began to accelerate. Patricia, Morrison, and Marcus were approaching the intersection, engaged in conversation about the presentation. They were moving at a normal walking pace, completely unaware of the wet floor ahead of them. Sarah, realizing that the wrong people were about to encounter her sabotage, began to panic. She looked up from her moping and saw the group approaching. Her eyes went wide as she realized that instead of catching me in the trap, she was about to cause the CEO and the client to slip and fall. "Wait!" Sarah called out, dropping her mop. "The floor is..." But it was too late. Patricia, who was walking slightly ahead of the group and gesturing as she spoke, stepped directly into the wet area. Her expensive heels hit the slick surface, and she immediately lost her footing. What happened next unfolded in slow motion. Patricia's briefcase flew from her hand as she windmilled her arms, trying to regain balance. Morrison, reacting instinctively to help her, stepped forward into the same wet area and also began to slip. Marcus, with his police training and quick reflexes, managed to catch Morrison's arm and steady him, but Patricia went down hard, landing awkwardly on her side with a sharp cry of pain. The sound of Patricia hitting the floor echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. "Patricia!" Morrison shouted, immediately dropping to one knee beside her. Marcus was already on his radio, calling for emergency medical assistance, while Sarah stood frozen in horror, still holding her mop and staring at the scene she'd accidentally created. And Richard was emerging from around the corner with a look of complete shock on his face. This was definitely not part of his plan. "What happened?" Richard asked, trying to sound concerned while clearly struggling to process how his carefully orchestrated sabotage had gone so spectacularly wrong. "The floor was wet," Morrison said, his voice sharp with anger as he helped Patricia sit up. "Someone was mopping, and there was no warning, no wet floor signs, nothing." Patricia was clearly in pain, holding her left wrist gingerly and grimacing as she tried to move. "I think I may have broken something," she said through gritted teeth. Marcus had finished calling for paramedics and was now examining the scene with his trained eye. "Ma'am, there should have been proper safety protocols in place for floor cleaning during business hours. Wet floor signs, barriers, something to warn people." He looked directly at Sarah, who was still standing there looking terrified. "Ms. Chen, what's the standard procedure for cleaning floors when employees and visitors are in the building?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. We're supposed to put up signs and barriers, and we don't usually clean the main walkways during peak hours." "Then why were you mopping this area right now?" Marcus asked, his tone becoming more interrogative. Sarah looked desperately at Richard, who was clearly trying to figure out how to distance himself from the situation. I was asked to. There was a special request." "A special request from whom?" Patricia asked, her CEO instincts kicking in despite her injury. The hallway fell silent except for the sound of approaching sirens. Sarah looked back and forth between Richard and Patricia, clearly realizing that she was about to become the scapegoat for the entire incident. "That's when I made my entrance." "Oh my God, what happened?" I said, rushing toward the group from the stairwell. "Patricia, are you okay?" "Jessica, thank goodness you're here," Morrison said. "There's been an accident. Patricia slipped on a wet floor." I looked around at the scene. Patricia on the floor holding her wrist, Marcus documenting everything, Sarah looking like she wanted to disappear, and Richard standing there with an expression that was equal parts confusion and panic. "This is terrible," I said, kneeling down beside Patricia. "Should I call 911? "Already done," Marcus replied. "Paramedics should be here any minute." As if on cue, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the stairwell as the EMT team arrived. Marcus directed them to Patricia, who was now looking very pale and clearly in significant pain. While the paramedics were assessing Patricia's injuries, Morrison turned to Richard with a steely expression. "Mr. Kellerman, I believe you're the supervisor for this floor. Can you explain to me how this accident occurred?" Richard's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. Honestly, I have no idea. This shouldn't have happened. Our cleaning protocols are very strict about safety procedures." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Yet here we are. Your CEO is injured. Your facilities coordinator was mopping a main walkway during peak business hours without proper safety measures. And you, as the floor supervisor, were apparently unaware of any of this." The paramedics had determined that Patricia likely had a fractured wrist and possibly a concussion. As they prepared to transport her to the hospital, she looked up at Morrison with genuine regret in her eyes. "James, I'm so sorry about this. Our presentation." "Don't worry about the presentation right now," Morrison said firmly. "Your health is the priority. But I have to say, this incident raises some serious questions about the operational competence of this organization." As the paramedics wheeled Patricia toward the elevator, the remaining group stood in the hallway, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone. Morrison looked at his watch, then at Richard. "Mr. Kellerman, under the circumstances, I think we should postpone this presentation indefinitely. I need to understand how this accident occurred before I can feel comfortable moving forward with any business relationship." Richard's face went completely white. The Morrison Industries contract, the $50 million deal that was supposed to secure his promotion, was slipping away along with Patricia on that stretcher. As Morrison's words hung in the air about postponing the presentation indefinitely, I knew this was the moment I'd been waiting for. Richard stood there looking like a man watching his career crumble in real time, while Sarah appeared ready to bolt from the building entirely. But I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. "Mr. Morrison, I said, stepping forward with my presentation materials still in hand. I completely understand your concerns about what just happened. But before you make any final decisions about Meridian marketing, I think there are some things you need to know about this incident. Morrison raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by my tone. What do you mean, Ms. Martinez? I looked directly at Richard, whose expression had shifted from panic to suspicion. He could sense that something was wrong, but he couldn't quite figure out what. Well, the truth is, this wasn't actually an accident, I said calmly. This was a deliberate sabotage attempt that just happened to catch the wrong people. The hallway went dead silent. Marcus stopped writing in his incident report notebook and looked up sharply. Sarah's face went from pale to completely white. And Richard looked like he'd been struck by lightning. That's a very serious accusation, Jessica, Richard said, his voice carefully controlled but with an edge of warning. I think the stress of this situation might be affecting your judgment. Is it? I replied, pulling out my phone. Because I have some very interesting audio recordings that suggest otherwise. Morrison stepped closer, his business instincts clearly activated. What kind of recordings? I opened the audio app on my phone and found the file from earlier that morning. This is a conversation between Richard Kellerman and Sarah Chen, recorded about an hour ago in Sarah's office. Jessica, what do you think you're doing? Richard's voice was rising now, panic beginning to show through his attempted composure. Playing the truth, I said, and pressed play. Richard's voice filled the hallway with crystal clarity. Remember, 9:45 a.m. exactly. The cleaning crew finishes that area, and then you make sure they're gone before Jessica arrives. We want the floor wet, but no witnesses to the cleaning activity. Sarah's response followed. I understand. The hallway will be slippery enough to guarantee a fall, but it'll look like a simple accident. And you're sure about the timing? Morrison's expression grew darker with each word. Marcus had stopped pretending to write his report and was now listening intently, his law enforcement background clearly engaged. The recording continued with Richard's voice. Jessica always gets here between 9:15 and 9:30 for important presentations. She'll be carrying materials, probably moving fast, and she always takes that route from the elevator to the conference room. Physics will do the rest. Stop it, Richard said sharply, reaching for my phone. This is taken completely out of context. Don't touch my phone, I said, stepping back. And there's more. I let the recording continue. After she falls, I'll be the concerned supervisor who immediately steps up to handle the presentation. Morrison Industries will be impressed by my crisis management skills, and Jessica will be dealing with injuries that conveniently remove her from the picture. Morrison's face had gone from concerned to furious. Are you telling me that this entire incident was planned? That you deliberately caused my host to be injured so you could steal credit for her work? That's exactly what I'm telling you, I said. Except the plan was for me to be the one lying on that stretcher right now, not Patricia. Richard was shaking his head frantically. This is insane. Jessica, you're clearly having some kind of breakdown. Mr. Morrison, I assure you that. Let the recording finish, Morrison said coldly. Sarah's voice came through the speaker. What if she's not hurt badly enough to miss the presentation? Richard's response was damning. Trust me, the way I've planned this, she'll be lucky if she doesn't break something. But even if she's just shaken up and bruised, she won't be in any condition to deliver a high-stakes presentation to a $50 million client. The hallway was so quiet you could hear the building's air conditioning cycling on. Morrison looked at Richard with the kind of expression usually reserved for something you'd scrape off your shoe. Mr. Kellerman, Morrison said, his voice dangerously calm. Did you just admit on tape to planning to physically injure an employee so you could steal her work and impress me with your quote-quote crisis management skills? That recording could be faked, Richard said desperately. It's completely fabricated. Jessica has been struggling with the pressure of this account, and she's obviously trying to. Sarah, Morrison interrupted, turning to the facilities coordinator who looked like she was about to faint. Is what we just heard accurate? Sarah looked back and forth between Richard and Morrison, clearly realizing that her career was over regardless of what she said. Finally, she nodded miserably. He promised me a promotion, she whispered. The facilities manager position. He said if I helped him with this, he'd make sure I got promoted when he became regional director. Marcus stepped forward, his security background taking over. Ms. Chen, are you confirming that you deliberately created an unsafe condition in this hallway with the intent to cause Ms. Martinez to fall and injure herself? Yes, Sarah said, barely audible. And Mr. Kellerman, you orchestrated this plan and bribed Ms. Chen to participate? Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. This is all being blown completely out of proportion. It was never meant to. Never meant to what? Morrison demanded. Never meant to seriously injure someone? Never meant to get caught? What exactly was it never meant to do, Mr. Kellerman? But I wasn't finished yet. There's more evidence, I said, pulling out my phone again. I also have video footage of the actual setup. Video footage? Marcus asked sharply. I placed a camera in the hallway this morning after I overheard Richard planning this last night. It should have captured Sarah mopping the floor specifically to create the slippery conditions. I opened the camera app on my phone, which was connected to the wireless camera I'd hidden earlier. The footage was crystal clear, showing Sarah emerging from the facilities closet with her mop bucket, then systematically creating the wet floor conditions in the exact location where Richard had planned for me to fall. That's Sarah creating the hazardous condition, I said, narrating the video. Notice how she's not putting up any wet floor signs or safety barriers. And watch the timestamp. This is happening at exactly 9:43 a.m., which matches the timing they discussed in the audio recording. Morrison watched the video with the expression of a man who just discovered his business partner had been embezzling from him. So not only did you plan to injure Ms. Martinez, but your incompetent execution of this plan resulted in injuring your own CEO instead. And potentially derailing a $50 million contract, Marcus added, his security officer instincts clearly engaged. Mr. Morrison, I think you should know that this incident is going to require a full investigation. We're talking about premeditated assault, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment. Richard seemed to realize that his situation was beyond salvaging. Look, it wasn't supposed to happen like this. Jessica has been getting credit for work that the whole team contributed to. I've been with this company for 12 years, and I deserve recognition for what? I interrupted. For planning to send me to the hospital so you could steal my presentation? For bribing a facilities coordinator to help you create a dangerous situation? For putting our CEO in an ambulance because you're too incompetent to advance your career through actual work? Morrison pulled out his phone. Ms. Martinez, I want you to send me copies of both that audio recording and the video footage immediately. My legal team is going to need to review all of this. Of course, I said, already working on the file transfers. Mr. Kellerman, Morrison continued, I want you to know that Morrison Industries will be filing a formal complaint with your executive team about this incident. We'll also be providing all of this evidence to the appropriate authorities. Authorities? Richard's voice cracked. Yes, Marcus said, stepping forward again. What you've described constitutes assault, conspiracy, and several other charges. This isn't a workplace disagreement. This is criminal behavior. Morrison looked at me with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Ms. Martinez, I have to ask, how did you know this was going to happen? I overheard Richard planning it last night when I was working late, I explained. I was walking past his office around 9 p.m., and he was on the phone with Sarah discussing the whole scheme. At first, I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but then I realized he was serious about deliberately injuring me to steal my work. And instead of just reporting it, you decided to set a trap of your own, Morrison observed. I knew that if I just reported it without evidence, it would be my word against his. Richard has been with the company for 12 years and has relationships throughout the organization. I've only been in my senior role for 18 months. I needed irrefutable proof of what he was planning. Morrison nodded slowly. That was remarkably strategic thinking under pressure. The ironic thing, I continued, is that Richard's plan might have actually worked if he'd executed it properly. But his arrogance and poor planning turned his trap into his own downfall. Marcus was taking notes again, documenting everything for what was clearly going to become a significant legal matter. Mr. Kellerman, I'm going to need you to remain available for questioning. This incident report is going to become part of a criminal investigation." Richard looked around the hallway desperately, as if searching for some escape route or ally. But Sarah was too busy trying to figure out how to minimize her own legal exposure. Morrison was clearly disgusted with the entire situation, and Marcus was treating him like a suspect in a criminal case. "This is insane," Richard said weakly. "It was just office politics. Things like this happen in business all the time." "No, they don't," Morrison replied sharply. "Planning to physically injure a colleague to steal their work is not office politics. It's assault and fraud." My phone buzzed with a call from the hospital. Patricia's assistant was calling to update us on her condition. "Patricia has a fractured wrist and a mild concussion," I reported after taking the call. "She's going to be okay, but she'll be out of work for at least a week." Morrison looked relieved about Patricia's condition, but his expression hardened again when he looked at Richard. "Mr. Kellerman, your actions didn't just put Ms. Martinez at risk. They actually injured your own CEO and potentially cost your company a major contract. I hope whatever promotion you were chasing was worth destroying your career." The elevator doors opened, and several people emerged, members of our executive team who had heard about the incident and came to assess the situation. Among them was David Park, our chief operating officer, who took one look at the scene and immediately understood that something major had happened. "What's going on here?" David asked, his eyes taking in the wet floor, the serious expressions, and the obvious tension. "David," I said, "I think you need to hear something." I played the audio recording again, this time for David's benefit. His expression grew more horrified with each revelation. When the recording finished, he looked at Richard with complete disgust. "Richard, you're fired," David said simply. "Security will escort you out of the building immediately. Don't bother cleaning out your office. We'll box up your personal items and have them delivered." "You can't fire me over this," Richard protested. "I have rights. There are procedures." "The procedures don't cover criminal conspiracy to commit assault," David replied. "And given what Mr. Morrison has told me about the potential legal ramifications, terminating your employment is the least of your concerns." Marcus stepped forward again. "Mr. Kellerman, I'm going to need to escort you to the security office while we wait for the police to arrive. You're not under arrest yet, but you're not free to leave the building either." As Marcus led Richard toward the elevator, I could see the full weight of his situation finally hitting him. His plan to steal my work and advance his career had not only failed spectacularly, but had also cost him his job, exposed him to serious criminal charges, and probably ended his career in marketing permanently. But as satisfying as Richard's downfall was, I realized that the most important question hadn't been answered yet. What was going to happen with the Morrison Industries presentation? As Marcus escorted Richard toward the elevator, Morrison turned to me with an expression that was part curiosity, part admiration. "Ms. Martinez, I have to say what you've accomplished here is extraordinary. You've exposed a criminal conspiracy, protected yourself from serious injury, and demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking under pressure." David Park nodded in agreement. "Jessica, I'm honestly amazed by how you handled this situation. But I have to ask, what happens now with the Morrison Industries presentation? Patricia is in the hospital. Richard is being arrested, and we're supposed to be delivering the most important pitch in our company's history." That's when I smiled for the first time all morning. "Actually, David, that's not a problem at all. I'm fully prepared to deliver the presentation exactly as scheduled." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Even after everything that's just happened?" "Especially after everything that's just happened," I replied. "See, the presentation I've prepared isn't just good. It's exceptional. Richard wanted to steal it because he knew it was the kind of work that could transform someone's career. The difference is I actually did the work." I looked around the hallway, where the maintenance crew was already cleaning up the water that had caused so much chaos. "Mr. Morrison, if you're willing, I'd like to show you why Richard was so desperate to claim credit for this project." Morrison checked his watch. It was now 10:15 a.m., 15 minutes past our originally scheduled start time. "You know what, Ms. Martinez? After what I've witnessed here today, I'm very interested to see what you've created." David looked relieved. "The conference room is ready whenever you are. I'll join you for the presentation if that's acceptable." "Of course," I said. But first, there's something I want to show you both. I led them to the conference room, where my presentation was already loaded and ready to go. But instead of starting with the slides, I pulled up the security camera footage on my laptop. Before we begin the formal presentation, I want you to see something that demonstrates exactly what kind of person Richard Kellerman really is. I played the footage from the previous evening, the recording I'd made of Richard's phone conversation where he outlined his entire sabotage plan. Morrison and David listened in stunned silence as Richard's voice filled the room, detailing his scheme to injure me and steal my work. This was recorded last night around 9 p.m., I explained. Richard thought he was alone in the building, but I was working late preparing for today's presentation. When I overheard this conversation, I realized I had two choices. I could report it and hope someone believed me, or I could gather evidence and expose him completely. Morrison leaned back in his chair, clearly impressed. You chose to fight back. I chose to protect myself and my work, I corrected. But I also chose to make sure that Richard could never do this to anyone else. David was shaking his head in disbelief. Jessica, the level of planning and execution you demonstrated here is honestly incredible. You turned his own trap against him perfectly. The ironic thing is that Richard's plan might have worked if he'd been more competent, I said. But his arrogance and poor attention to detail created the opportunity for me to turn the tables on him. Morrison laughed, the first time he'd shown any humor since arriving at our office. Ms. Martinez, in my 40 years of business, I've learned that the most dangerous competitors are the ones who are smart enough to think strategically but stupid enough to underestimate their opponents. Mr. Kellerman clearly fell into that category. Now, I said, switching to my presentation slides, let me show you why Richard was so desperate to steal this work. For the next 90 minutes, I delivered what I knew was the best presentation of my career. Every slide had been meticulously crafted, every data point carefully researched, and every recommendation strategically developed. I walked Morrison and David through our comprehensive analysis of Morrison Industries' market position, outlined detailed strategies for expanding into new demographics, and presented implementation timelines that were both ambitious and realistic. But more than just the content, I could feel the confidence and authority that came from knowing I'd earned every word of what I was presenting. This wasn't stolen work or borrowed ideas. This was 3 months of dedicated effort, late nights, and genuine strategic thinking. Morrison asked detailed questions throughout the presentation, testing my knowledge of his industry, challenging my assumptions, and probing the depth of my research. Every question I answered confidently, with supporting data and real-world examples that demonstrated I understood not just his business, but his specific challenges and opportunities. Ms. Martinez, Morrison said when I finished, this is without question the most comprehensive and insightful marketing strategy anyone has ever presented to Morrison Industries. The depth of research, the creativity of the solutions, and the practical implementation approach, it's exactly what we need. David was beaming. Jessica, this presentation is extraordinary. I can see why Richard was so desperate to claim credit for it. Morrison stood up and extended his hand to me. Ms. Martinez, I'm prepared to move forward with this contract immediately, but I have one condition. My heart skipped a beat. What's that, Mr. Morrison? I want you to be the primary point of contact for this account, not just for the initial implementation, but for the entire duration of our relationship. After what I've seen today, both your professional work and your personal character, I trust you to handle this partnership. I felt a surge of satisfaction that was even sweeter than Richard's downfall. Mr. Morrison, I would be honored to serve as your primary contact. Excellent, Morrison said, pulling out his phone. I'm going to call my legal team right now and have them begin drafting the contract. I want this partnership formalized as quickly as possible. As Morrison stepped out to make his call, David turned to me with an expression of genuine admiration. Jessica, what you've accomplished here today goes far beyond just landing this contract. You've demonstrated leadership, strategic thinking, and integrity under pressure that frankly puts most of our senior management to shame. Thank you, David. But honestly, I was just protecting myself and my work. No, it was more than that. You could have simply avoided Richard's trap and delivered your presentation without exposing him. Instead, You chose to make sure he faced consequences for his actions. That takes courage. Morrison returned from his phone call with a satisfied expression. My legal team is drafting the contract now. We should have everything finalized within 48 hours. The initial contract value is $55 million over 5 years, with performance bonuses that could increase that to $70 million. The numbers were even better than we'd originally hoped. This wasn't just a career-defining contract. It was potentially a company-transforming partnership. There's something else, Morrison continued. I've been impressed enough with what I've seen today that I want to discuss expanding our relationship beyond just marketing services. Morrison Industries is looking for a strategic consulting partner for several of our subsidiaries. If this initial project goes well, we could be talking about a much larger long-term relationship. David looked like he was trying not to faint. A contract of that magnitude would secure Meridian Marketing's future for years to come. Mr. Morrison, we would be thrilled to discuss expanding our partnership, David said. Good, but I want to be clear. My confidence in this relationship is specifically tied to Ms. Martinez's involvement. She's demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking and personal integrity that Morrison Industries values in our partners. Over the next hour, we worked through the preliminary details of the contract and discussed timelines for implementation. Morrison's enthusiasm for the project was obvious, and his confidence in my abilities was both flattering and professionally validating. Around noon, Patricia called from the hospital. Her assistant had updated her on the morning's events, and she wanted to speak with me directly. Jessica? Patricia's voice was slightly groggy from pain medication, but her tone was sharp and focused. I understand that Richard Kellerman deliberately caused my accident as part of a plan to sabotage you and steal your work. That's correct, Patricia. I have recorded evidence of the entire conspiracy. And I understand that you not only exposed his plan, but also successfully delivered the Morrison Industries presentation and secured the contract. Yes, we've reached a preliminary agreement for a $55 million partnership. There was a pause on the line, and then Patricia laughed, a sound I'd never heard from her before. Jessica, in 15 years of running this company, I have never seen a more perfect example of someone turning adversity into opportunity. Richard tried to destroy your career, and instead, you've secured the biggest contract in our company's history. I just did what needed to be done, Patricia. No, you did much more than that. You demonstrated leadership, strategic thinking, and character that honestly surpasses most of our executive team. Which brings me to why I'm calling. My pulse quickened. Yes? Richard's termination leaves us with an immediate opening for a regional director position. It's a role that comes with significant responsibility for client relationships, team leadership, and strategic planning. Based on what you've accomplished today, I want to offer you that position. I was speechless. The regional director position was exactly the role Richard had been scheming to obtain. The irony was almost too perfect. Patricia, I'm honored by the offer. What would this mean in terms of responsibilities and reporting structure? You'd be responsible for all client relationships over $10 million. You'd manage a team of 12 account managers, and you'd report directly to David and me. The salary is $140,000, plus performance bonuses tied to client retention and new business development. It was nearly double my current salary, with responsibilities that would position me for even greater advancement within the company. I accept, I said without hesitation. Excellent. We'll make the announcement company-wide this afternoon. I want everyone to understand that this promotion is based on merit, performance, and the kind of leadership you've demonstrated today. After Patricia ended the call, I sat in the conference room for a moment, trying to process everything that had happened. 12 hours earlier, I'd been preparing for what I thought would be the biggest presentation of my career, unaware that my boss was planning to sabotage me. Now, Richard was facing criminal charges, I'd landed the largest contract in company history, and I'd been promoted to the exact position he'd been scheming to obtain. Morrison was wrapping up his own phone calls and preparing to leave. Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that today has been one of the most interesting business meetings I've ever attended. I came here expecting a standard marketing presentation, and instead I witnessed corporate espionage, criminal conspiracy, and some of the most impressive problem-solving I've seen in decades. It's definitely been an unusual morning, I agreed. I'll be very interested to see how you handle the implementation of our marketing strategy. Based on what I've observed today, I suspect you're going to exceed even my high expectations. As Morrison left the building, I remained in the conference room, looking out at the city through the large windows. The same view that had seemed routine that morning now looked different, full of possibility and opportunity. David knocked on the conference room door. "Jessica, there's one more thing we need to discuss." "What's that?" "Richard's termination and criminal charges are going to generate some publicity. We need to be prepared for media attention, both positive and negative. Are you comfortable being the public face of how we handled this situation?" I thought about it for a moment. The story would certainly make headlines: corporate sabotage, criminal conspiracy, and a dramatic reversal of fortune. But I'd done nothing wrong, and everything I'd accomplished had been through legitimate means. "David, I'm proud of everything I did today. If telling this story helps other people recognize and respond to workplace sabotage, then I'm happy to be the public face of it." "Good. Because I suspect this story is going to inspire a lot of people who feel like they're being undermined or sabotaged at work." As the afternoon progressed, news of the morning's events spread throughout the company. Richard's termination and arrest became the subject of intense speculation, while my promotion and the Morrison Industries contract generated excitement and congratulations from colleagues. But the most satisfying moment came around 4 p.m., when I received a call from Marcus in the security office. "Ms. Martinez, I wanted to update you on Mr. Kellerman's situation. The police have officially charged him with conspiracy to commit assault, reckless endangerment, and fraud. Ms. Chen has agreed to testify against him in exchange for a reduced sentence. What does that mean for Richard? Given the evidence you provided and Ms. Chen's cooperation, he's looking at potential jail time, significant fines, and a permanent criminal record. His career in corporate management is essentially over." The justice felt complete. Richard had tried to destroy my career through criminal means, and instead had destroyed his own life completely. That evening, as I packed up my desk to move to my new office on the 3rd floor, ironically, just down the hall from where Richard's office had been, I reflected on the day's events. Richard Kellerman had taught me an important lesson, though probably not the one he'd intended. He'd shown me that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones who underestimate you. His arrogance, his assumption that I would be helpless against his scheme, and his poor execution had created the opportunity for me to not just survive his attack, but to thrive beyond anything I could have imagined. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting ahead. And thanks to Richard's spectacular failure, I was now positioned for a career trajectory that might have taken years to achieve through normal advancement. As I turned off the lights in my old office for the last time, I couldn't help but smile. Richard had wanted to make my career take a fall, but in the end, the only career that fell was his own. And my career? It was just getting started. 3 weeks after what the local business press had dubbed the Meridian Incident, I was settling into my new corner office on the 3rd floor when my assistant, Kevin, knocked on my door with a peculiar expression on his face. "Jessica, there's someone here to see you. She says she's Richard Kellerman's wife, and she's asking for a few minutes of your time." I felt a chill run down my spine. Richard had been released on bail pending his trial, and the last thing I wanted was a confrontation with his family members. But curiosity got the better of me. "Send her in, Kevin, but stay close by, just in case." The woman who entered my office was nothing like what I'd expected. Margaret Kellerman was a petite woman in her early 40s, impeccably dressed in a navy business suit, with kind eyes that showed the strain of recent events. She carried herself with dignity, despite what had to be an incredibly difficult situation. "Ms. Martinez, thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this must be awkward given everything that's happened." I gestured to the chairs in front of my desk. "Please, have a seat. Can I offer you some coffee or water?" "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." As I poured coffee from the machine in my office, Margaret looked around at the space, the same floor where her husband had worked for 12 years before his spectacular downfall. "I wanted to come here in person to apologize," Margaret said as I handed her the coffee. "What Richard did was inexcusable, and I needed you to know that his actions don't represent our family's values." I sat down across from her, studying her face. There was genuine remorse there, but also something else. Relief, perhaps? Mrs. Kellerman, you don't need to apologize for your husband's choices. You weren't responsible for what he did. Margaret sighed deeply. In a way, I was. I knew Richard was becoming increasingly bitter about his career. He felt passed over, undervalued, and he was growing more resentful every day. I should have pushed him to get professional help or encouraged him to find a new job where he could be happier. That still doesn't make his actions your fault, I said gently. Perhaps not. But I want you to understand something about Richard that might help explain, though not excuse, what he did. Margaret set down her coffee cup and looked directly at me. Richard came from a family where achievement was everything. His father was a successful lawyer, his brother is a surgeon, and Richard always felt like the family failure. When he got his job at Meridian 12 years ago, he thought it was his chance to finally prove himself worthy. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But Richard never learned how to earn success through hard work and integrity. He learned how to take shortcuts, how to claim credit for other people's efforts, and how to politic his way into positions he hadn't really earned. This was fascinating insight into Richard's psychology, but I wasn't sure where Margaret was going with it. The Morrison Industries account represented everything Richard thought he needed to finally earn his family's respect, Margaret continued. When he realized you were going to get the credit for landing that contract, something in him snapped. He convinced himself that you had somehow stolen what rightfully belonged to him. But I didn't steal anything, I said. I did the work. I know that, and deep down, Richard knew it too. That's what made his resentment so toxic. He knew you had earned what he was trying to take. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. Richard wanted me to give you this. He's too ashamed to face you directly, but he asked me to deliver his written apology. I took the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. How is Richard doing with everything? Not well, Margaret admitted. He's been fired, he's facing criminal charges, and his reputation in the industry is destroyed. But honestly, Jessica, I think this might be the best thing that could have happened to him. That surprised me. What do you mean? Richard has been living a lie for years, taking credit for other people's work and advancing through manipulation rather than merit. It was eating away at him, making him bitter and paranoid. Now that everything has collapsed, he's finally being forced to confront who he really is and what he's really capable of. Margaret stood up, smoothing her skirt. I wanted to thank you for handling the situation the way you did. You could have simply avoided Richard's trap and let him continue his destructive behavior. Instead, you made sure he faced consequences for his actions. In the long run, that might save him from himself. After Margaret left, I sat in my office holding Richard's letter, debating whether to read it. Finally, curiosity won out. The letter was handwritten on personal stationery, and Richard's normally confident handwriting looked shaky and uncertain. Jessica, I know there's nothing I can say that will undo what I tried to do to you. My actions were criminal, inexcusable, and beneath the standards of basic human decency. You trusted me as your supervisor, and I betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. I want you to know that my plan to sabotage you had nothing to do with your abilities or your character. You are an exceptional marketing professional who earned every bit of success you've achieved. My actions came from my own insecurities and my inability to accept that you had accomplished what I couldn't. I've spent the last 3 weeks in therapy, trying to understand how I became the kind of person who would plan to physically harm a colleague to advance my career. What I've learned about myself isn't pleasant, but it's necessary. Asai, I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that exposing my plan was the right thing to do, and I'm grateful that you prevented me from becoming someone even worse than I already was. I hope you find continued success at Meridian Marketing. You've earned it. Richard, I read the letter twice, trying to process the mixture of emotions it brought up. There was anger at what Richard had tried to do, satisfaction at his downfall, and surprisingly a small amount of sympathy for a man who had destroyed his life through his own poor choices. My reflection was interrupted by Kevin's voice over the intercom. Jessica, James Morrison is here for your weekly check-in meeting. The Morrison Industries implementation had been proceeding flawlessly. True to his word, Morrison had fast-tracked our contract. and we'd already begun executing the first phases of the marketing strategy. Morrison himself had been incredibly hands-on, working directly with me to ensure every detail met his exacting standards. "James, good morning," I said as Morrison entered my office. "How are things progressing with the demographic expansion pilot?" "Better than expected," Morrison replied, settling into his usual chair. "The preliminary response rates are 15% higher than our projections. Your team's messaging strategy is resonating perfectly with our target audience." Over the past 3 weeks, I'd come to understand why Morrison Industries had become so successful. James Morrison was demanding but fair, detail-oriented but not micromanaging, and he had an instinct for recognizing quality work. Working with him had been both challenging and professionally rewarding. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding the subsidiary consulting opportunities," Morrison said. "I'd like to move forward with expanding our relationship." "That's excellent news. Which subsidiaries are you considering?" "All of them," Morrison said with a slight smile. "Morrison Technologies, Morrison Real Estate, and Morrison Manufacturing. We're talking about a comprehensive strategic partnership worth approximately $200 million over 7 years." I felt my heart skip a beat. A contract of that magnitude would make Meridian Marketing one of the largest independent agencies on the West Coast. "James, that's an incredible opportunity. What would be the scope of work?" "Complete marketing strategy development, brand positioning, digital transformation consulting, and ongoing strategic advisory services. Essentially, I want Meridian Marketing to become Morrison Industries' primary strategic partner for all marketing and business development activities." Morrison leaned forward in his chair. "But I want to be clear about something, Jessica. This expanded partnership is contingent on your continued involvement. What I've seen from you over the past 3 weeks has convinced me that you're exactly the kind of strategic partner Morrison Industries needs." The magnitude of what Morrison was proposing began to sink in. This wasn't just a career-defining opportunity, it was potentially a life-changing one. "I'm incredibly honored by your confidence, James. What would be the timeline for implementing this expanded partnership?" "I'd like to begin immediately. My board of directors is meeting next week to approve the budget allocation, and I want to present them with a comprehensive proposal for our partnership." Morrison stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. "Jessica, in my 40 years of business, I've learned to recognize exceptional talent when I see it. What you demonstrated 3 weeks ago, the strategic thinking, the integrity under pressure, the ability to turn a crisis into an opportunity, that's the kind of leadership Morrison Industries values." "Thank you, James. I promise you won't regret this decision." "I know I won't. But there's something else we need to discuss." Morrison turned back from the window with a serious expression. "A partnership of this magnitude is going to require significant expansion of your team and your operational capacity. Are you prepared for that level of growth and responsibility?" It was a fair question. Managing a $200 million partnership would require resources and capabilities that Meridian Marketing didn't currently possess. "What kind of expansion are we talking about?" I asked. "You'd need to build a dedicated Morrison Industries division within Meridian Marketing. Probably 20 to 30 additional staff members, including senior strategists, account managers, creative directors, and data analysts. You'd essentially be running a company within a company." The challenge was exciting and intimidating in equal measure. But as I thought about it, I realized this was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been preparing for my entire career. "James, if Meridian Marketing commits to this expansion, what kind of timeline would we be working with?" "I'd want the new division operational within 6 months. I know it's aggressive, but Morrison Industries moves quickly when we identify the right partners." Morrison gathered his materials and prepared to leave. "Think about what we've discussed, Jessica. Talk to Patricia and David about the operational requirements. If you decide to move forward, I'll need a comprehensive proposal by the end of next week." After Morrison left, I sat in my office trying to process the enormity of what had just been offered. 6 weeks ago, I'd been a senior account manager preparing for the biggest presentation of my career. Now I was potentially looking at building and leading a multi-million-dollar division within our agency. The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard's attempt to sabotage my career had instead catapulted me into opportunities I might never have encountered otherwise. His criminal conspiracy had exposed him as unfit for leadership, while demonstrating my ability to handle crisis situations and complex strategic challenges. I picked up my phone and called Patricia, who was back in the office but still wearing a cast on her wrist. "Patricia, I need to discuss something significant with you and David. James Morrison just offered us a $200 million expanded partnership, but it would require major operational changes." "$200 million?" Patricia's voice was sharp with excitement. "Jessica, get David and come to my office immediately. We need to discuss this right now." 20 minutes later, I was in Patricia's office with David, outlining Morrison's proposal in detail. Both of them listened with increasing amazement as I described the scope and scale of the potential partnership. This would transform Meridian Marketing from a mid-sized regional agency into a major player in the national market, David said when I finished. Patricia was already running calculations on her computer. The revenue impact would be extraordinary. We could expand into new markets, hire top-tier talent, and compete for clients we've never been able to pursue before. But it would also require significant investment and risk, I pointed out. We'd need to hire 30 people, lease additional office space, and commit to service levels we've never attempted before. Patricia looked at me with the expression she reserved for the most important business decisions. "Jessica, do you believe we can deliver on Morrison's expectations?" I thought about everything I'd learned about James Morrison over the past 3 weeks. His standards, his business philosophy, and his expectations for strategic partnerships. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "It will be challenging, but I believe we can not only meet his expectations but exceed them." David nodded slowly. "If Morrison Industries is willing to commit $200 million to this partnership, they obviously believe in our capabilities. The question is whether we believe in ourselves enough to take this leap." Patricia made a decision with the kind of quick thinking that had built Meridian Marketing from nothing into a successful agency. "We're going to do it," she said firmly. "Jessica, I want you to begin developing the proposal immediately. David, start working on the operational planning for the expansion. We have 1 week to put together the most comprehensive partnership proposal in our company's history." As I left Patricia's office, my mind was already racing with the challenges and opportunities ahead. Building a division of this size and scope would require every skill I'd developed in my career, plus capabilities I'd have to learn along the way. But as I thought about Richard's failed sabotage attempt and how it had led to this moment, I realized something important. Sometimes, the best opportunities come disguised as crises. Richard had tried to destroy my career, but instead had created the circumstances that allowed me to demonstrate my true capabilities. The next week was going to determine whether I could transform potential into reality. But for the first time in my career, I felt completely confident in my ability to succeed at whatever challenges lay ahead. After all, if I could outwit a criminal conspiracy and turn attempted sabotage into career advancement, building a multi-million-dollar strategic partnership should be just another day at the office. 6 months later, I stood in the gleaming new Morrison Industries Strategic Partnership Division offices on the 4th floor of the Meridian Marketing Building, watching my team of 32 professionals work on campaigns that would have been impossible to imagine a year earlier. The transformation had been complete, not just of our company, but of my entire life. The morning started like any other, with my usual 7 a.m. team briefing in our state-of-the-art conference room. As I looked around the table at the faces of my senior strategists, creative directors, and account managers, I still felt a sense of amazement at how quickly everything had changed. "All right, everyone," I said, calling the meeting to order. "Let's review our progress on the Morrison Technologies digital transformation campaign." Sarah Kim, our lead digital strategist whom I'd recruited from a top San Francisco agency, pulled up the latest performance metrics on the wall-mounted display. "We're exceeding all KPIs by at least 20%. The client satisfaction scores are the highest Morrison Industries has ever recorded for any vendor relationship." Michael Chen, our creative director, added, "The brand repositioning for Morrison Real Estate is testing incredibly well with focus groups. We should have final approval for the campaign launch by the end of the week." As my team reported on various projects, I couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought us to this point. The Morrison Industries partnership had exceeded even James Morrison's ambitious expectations. Our division had become the most profitable segment of Meridian marketing, and our success had attracted attention from major corporations across the country. But the real satisfaction came from something else entirely. Something that happened exactly 1 year after Richard Kellerman's failed sabotage attempt. After the team briefing, I returned to my corner office to find Kevin waiting with an unusual expression on his face. "Jessica, there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important." "Who is it?" Kevin hesitated. "It's Richard Kellerman." My blood went cold. Richard had been sentenced 18 months in prison, but I knew he'd been released early for good behavior. I hadn't heard from him since his wife had delivered his letter, and frankly, I'd hoped to keep it that way. "Does he seem stable?" I asked. "He seems different. Calmer, maybe? He's not demanding to see you. He just asked if you might have a few minutes to speak with him." I thought about it for a moment. Part of me wanted nothing to do with Richard Kellerman ever again. But another part was curious about what had happened to him during his time in prison and afterward. "Send him in, Kevin. But stay close by." The man who entered my office was barely recognizable as the Richard Kellerman I'd known. He was thinner, his hair was completely gray, and he carried himself with a humility I'd never seen before. He was wearing a simple button-down shirt and khakis, a far cry from the expensive suits he'd favored during his days at Meridian. "Jessica, thank you for agreeing to see me. I know I have no right to ask for your time." "Have a seat, Richard. What can I do for you?" Richard sat down carefully, as if he was afraid of making any sudden movements. "I wanted to tell you about what's happened since everything fell apart." "Okay." After I was released from prison, I spent months trying to figure out what to do with my life. My reputation in corporate marketing was destroyed, my savings were depleted by legal fees, and I had to face the reality that I'd wasted 12 years of my career taking credit for other people's work. Richard's voice was steady, but I could see the emotional weight he was carrying. "I ended up taking a job at a small nonprofit organization that helps formerly incarcerated people reintegrate into society. It pays about a quarter of what I used to make, but it's honest work helping people who are struggling the way I was." "That sounds like meaningful work," I said, genuinely surprised by this turn of events. "It is. And for the first time in my adult life, I'm doing work that I've actually earned, through my own efforts. No shortcuts. No taking credit for other people's achievements. No office politics. Just me, trying to help people who need it." Richard looked around my office, taking in the awards on the walls, the Morrison Industries partnership plaques, and the view of Seattle through the large windows. "I also wanted to tell you that I've been following your success. The Morrison Industries partnership, the expansion of Meridian marketing, your promotion to Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, it's exactly what you deserved all along." I felt a mix of emotions hearing Richard acknowledge what I'd accomplished. "Thank you. But why are you telling me this?" "Because I need you to understand something that I couldn't see a year ago. When I tried to sabotage you, I thought I was fighting for recognition that belonged to me. But the truth is, you were never my competition. You were operating on a completely different level." Richard leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "The work you did on the Morrison Industries account? The way you handled my sabotage attempt? The strategic thinking you demonstrated throughout that entire crisis? None of that was luck or politics. That was genuine talent and integrity in action." "Richard, I appreciate you saying that, but please, let me finish. I need to say this." I nodded for him to continue. "My therapist helped me understand that my resentment toward you wasn't really about your success. It was about my own failure to develop the skills and character that real success requires. You represented everything I wished I could be, but was too lazy and entitled to become." Richard's honesty was both surprising and somehow healing. I'd spent months wondering if I'd been too harsh in exposing his conspiracy, but hearing him take full responsibility for his actions confirmed that I'd made the right choice. "I also wanted you to know that exposing my plan probably saved my life," Richard continued. "If I'd succeeded in injuring you and stealing your work, I would have continued down that path until I eventually destroyed myself completely. Being forced to face the consequences of my actions was the wake-up call I needed." "What are your plans now?" I asked. I'm going back to school to get a master's degree in social work. I want to build a career helping people rather than exploiting them. It won't make me wealthy, but it will let me sleep at night. Richard stood up, extending his hand. I know forgiveness isn't something I can ask for, but I wanted you to know that I genuinely admire the person you've become and the success you've earned. I shook his hand, surprised to find that most of my anger toward him had faded. I hope you find the meaning you're looking for in your new career, Richard. Thank you, Jessica. And congratulations on everything you've accomplished. You've built something remarkable here. After Richard left, I sat in my office processing the unexpected encounter. In many ways, seeing him again provided closure I hadn't realized I needed. His transformation from the bitter, scheming supervisor to a humbled man seeking redemption was perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the entire saga. My reflection was interrupted by Kevin's voice over the intercom. Jessica, James Morrison is here for your monthly strategic review. Over the past year, my relationship with Morrison has evolved from client and vendor to something approaching genuine partnership. He'd become not just our biggest client, but also a mentor whose business wisdom had accelerated my professional development. James, good afternoon, I said as Morrison entered my office. I hope you're prepared for some impressive numbers from this month's campaigns. Morrison settled into his usual chair with the satisfied expression of a man whose business instincts had proven correct. I always look forward to these meetings, Jessica. Your team continues to exceed expectations. For the next hour, we reviewed performance metrics, discussed upcoming initiatives, and planned strategies for the next quarter. The Morrison Industries partnership had grown beyond even our most optimistic projections, and James was already discussing additional expansions. Jessica, there's something I want to discuss with you, Morrison said as our formal review concluded. Something that goes beyond our current partnership. I'm listening. Morrison pulled out a folder from his briefcase. Morrison Industries is launching a new venture capital fund focused on investing in innovative marketing and technology companies. We're looking for someone to serve as the fund's managing partner. My pulse quickened. A venture capital managing partner role would be a significant leap from my current position, even with all the success I'd achieved. The role would involve identifying promising companies, conducting due diligence, managing investments, and providing strategic guidance to portfolio companies. It's exactly the kind of strategic thinking and leadership capability you've demonstrated over the past year. Morrison leaned forward. The position comes with a significant equity stake in the fund, plus the opportunity to build something from the ground up. We're talking about a $50 million initial fund size, with plans to grow to $200 million over 5 years. I was speechless. A venture capital managing partner role would represent the ultimate validation of the strategic capabilities I developed, while offering financial rewards beyond anything I'd imagined. James, this is an incredible opportunity. What would be the timeline? We'd want you to start transitioning into the role over the next 6 months, with full responsibility beginning next year. Of course, we'd work with Meridian Marketing to ensure a smooth transition of your current responsibilities. Morrison stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where so much had changed over the past year. Jessica, when I first met you, I was impressed by your professional capabilities. But what convinced me to build our partnership wasn't just your marketing expertise. It was your character under pressure. The way you handled that crisis with your former supervisor demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity and strategic thinking that successful venture capital requires. I'm deeply honored by your confidence, James. Think about it over the weekend. If you're interested, we can begin discussing terms next week. After Morrison left, I walked to the window of my office, looking out at the same view that had seemed so routine just 18 months earlier. The city looked different now, full of opportunity and possibility that I was finally positioned to pursue. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Board meeting just approved your promotion to Executive Vice President. Congratulations. I smiled, remembering how desperately Richard had wanted a promotion to Regional Director. Now I was being offered positions that went far beyond anything he'd ever dreamed of achieving. That evening, I decided to take a walk through downtown Seattle to clear my head and process everything that had happened. As I strolled through Pike Place Market, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. 18 months ago, I'd been a senior account manager, preparing for what I thought would be the biggest presentation of my career. I'd had no idea that my boss was planning to sabotage me, no idea that I had the strategic capabilities to turn his trap against him, and certainly no idea that his failed conspiracy would launch me into opportunities I'd never imagined. The irony was almost poetic. Richard Kellerman had tried to make my career take a fall, but instead had provided the catalyst for me to rise higher than I'd ever thought possible. His criminal conspiracy had exposed his true character while revealing mine. His attempt to steal my work had instead showcased my abilities to the most important audience possible. As I walked along the waterfront, watching the ferries cross Elliott Bay in the evening light, I thought about the choices that had led to this moment. I could have simply reported Richard's plan and hoped for the best. I could have avoided his trap and delivered my presentation without exposing him, but I'd chosen to fight back strategically, to gather evidence, and to ensure that his actions had consequences. That choice had changed everything, not just for me, but for everyone involved. Richard had been forced to confront his own failures and find a more honest path forward. Patricia and David had learned valuable lessons about recognizing and developing real talent. Morrison Industries had found a strategic partner that exceeded their expectations, and I had discovered capabilities and opportunities I'd never known I possessed. My phone rang as I reached the end of the pier. It was Margaret Kellerman. "Jessica, I hope I'm not bothering you. Richard told me he visited you today, and I wanted to thank you for seeing him." "Of course, Margaret, he seems to be doing well." "He is. The work he's doing at the nonprofit has given him a sense of purpose he never had in corporate life. He's finally found a way to contribute something positive to the world." Margaret paused for a moment. "I also wanted you to know that Richard talks about you sometimes, not with resentment, but with genuine respect. He says you taught him that real success comes from earning it, not stealing it. I'm glad he's found peace with everything that happened." "Jessica, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret exposing Richard's plan? It destroyed his career and sent him to prison. Some people might have handled it differently." I thought about her question as I watched the sun set over the Olympic Mountains. "Margaret, I think about that sometimes. But I've come to believe that exposing Richard's plan was the kindest thing I could have done. For him, for me, and for everyone else he might have hurt if his behavior had continued." "I think you're right. Thank you for giving him the wake-up call he needed, even though it came at such a high cost." After Margaret hung up, I continued my walk along the waterfront, thinking about the lessons I'd learned over the past 18 months. The most important one was probably this: when someone tries to destroy you, the best revenge isn't necessarily getting even. It's becoming so successful that their attacks become irrelevant. Richard had tried to make me fall, but instead had taught me that I could fly. The next Monday morning, I called James Morrison to accept his offer to become managing partner of the Morrison Industries Venture Capital Fund. 6 months later, I was running a $50 million investment fund, identifying and supporting the next generation of innovative companies. And sometimes, when I was interviewing young entrepreneurs who reminded me of myself 18 months earlier, I would tell them about the most important lesson I'd learned in business. Your biggest opportunities often come disguised as your worst crises. The key is having the courage and wisdom to recognize them when they arrive. Richard Kellerman had tried to sabotage my career, but instead had given me the greatest gift possible: the chance to discover what I was truly capable of achieving. His career had taken the fall he'd planned for me. Mine had soared to heights neither of us had ever imagined. And that, I realized, was the perfect revenge. Not getting even, but getting ahead so far that the person who tried to hurt you becomes nothing more than a footnote in your success story. The moral of this story isn't just about workplace revenge. It's about the power of integrity, preparation, and strategic thinking in the face of adversity. When someone tries to destroy you, you have a choice. You can let them succeed, or you can use their attack as fuel for your own transformation. I chose transformation, and it made all the difference. But the story doesn't end there. 3 years after accepting the venture capital position, I found myself standing in front of the Seattle Business Council, delivering the keynote address at their annual leadership summit. The topic they'd asked me to speak about was turning crisis into opportunity, leadership lessons from the trenches. As I looked out at an audience of 500 business leaders, I realized that my journey from sabotage victim to venture capital managing partner had become something of a legend in Seattle's business community. The Meridian incident was now taught as a case study in business schools, and I regularly received speaking requests from organizations wanting to understand how to transform workplace adversity into competitive advantage. 3.5 years ago, I began my speech. I was preparing for what I thought would be the most important presentation of my career. I had no idea that my supervisor was planning to physically injure me so he could steal my work and claim credit for months of strategic planning. The audience was immediately engaged. Even though many of them had heard versions of this story before, there was something compelling about hearing it directly from the person who'd lived it. But here's what I've learned since then. The most dangerous person in your professional life isn't necessarily your competitor or your rival. It's the person who underestimates your ability to fight back intelligently and strategically. David knocked on the conference room door. "Jessica, there's one more thing we need to discuss." "What's that?" "Richard's termination and criminal charges are going to generate some publicity. We need to be prepared for media attention, both positive and negative. Are you comfortable being the public face of how we handled this situation?" I thought about it for a moment. The story would certainly make headlines. Corporate sabotage, criminal conspiracy, and a dramatic reversal of fortune. But I'd done nothing wrong, and everything I'd accomplished had been through legitimate means. "David, I'm proud of everything I did today. If telling this story helps other people recognize and respond to workplace sabotage, then I'm happy to be the public face of it." "Good. Because I suspect this story is going to inspire a lot of people who feel like they're being undermined or sabotaged at work." As the afternoon progressed, news of the morning's events spread throughout the company. Richard's termination and arrest became the subject of intense speculation, while my promotion and the Morrison Industries contract generated excitement and congratulations from colleagues. But the most satisfying moment came around 4 p.m., when I received a call from Marcus in the security office. "Ms. Martinez, I wanted to update you on Mr. Kellerman's situation. The police have officially charged him with conspiracy to commit assault, reckless endangerment, and fraud. Ms. Chen has agreed to testify against him in exchange for a reduced sentence. What does that mean for Richard? Given the evidence you provided and Ms. Chen's cooperation, he's looking at potential jail time, significant fines, and a permanent criminal record. His career in corporate management is essentially over." The justice felt complete. Richard had tried to destroy my career through criminal means, and instead had destroyed his own life completely. That evening, as I packed at my desk to move to my new office on the 3rd floor, ironically, just down the hall from where Richard's office had been, I reflected on the day's events. Richard Kellerman had taught me an important lesson, though probably not the one he'd intended. He'd shown me that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones who underestimate you. His arrogance, his assumption that I would be helpless against his scheme, and his poor execution had created the opportunity for me to not just survive his attack, but to thrive beyond anything I could have imagined. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting ahead. And thanks to Richard's spectacular failure, I was now positioned for a career trajectory that might have taken years to achieve through normal advancement. As I turned off the lights in my old office for the last time, I couldn't help but smile. Richard had wanted to make my career take a fall, but in the end, the only career that fell was his own. And my career? It was just getting started. 3 weeks after what the local business press had dubbed the Meridian incident, I was settling into my new corner office on the 3rd floor when my assistant, Kevin, knocked on my door with a peculiar expression on his face. "Jessica, there's someone here to see you. She says she's Richard Kellerman's wife, and she's asking for a few minutes of your time." I felt a chill run down my spine. Richard had been released on bail pending his trial, and the last thing I wanted was a confrontation with his family members. But curiosity got the better of me. "Send her in, Kevin, but stay close by, just in case." The woman who entered my office was nothing like what I'd expected. Margaret Kellerman was a petite woman in her early 40s, impeccably dressed in a navy business suit, with kind eyes that showed the strain of recent events. She carried herself with dignity, despite what had to be an incredibly difficult situation. I went on to describe not just what had happened, but the strategic thinking behind my response. how I'd recognized that simply avoiding Richard's trap wouldn't solve the underlying problem, how I'd gathered evidence methodically and positioned witnesses to ensure maximum exposure of his conspiracy, how I'd turned his own plan against him while protecting myself and advancing my career simultaneously. The key insight, I told the audience, is that crisis response isn't just about surviving the immediate threat. It's about recognizing that moments of maximum vulnerability can also be moments of maximum opportunity, if you have the courage and wisdom to act strategically rather than reactively. After my speech, I was approached by a young woman named Amanda Foster, who introduced herself as a marketing manager at a prominent tech company in Seattle. Ms. Martinez, thank you for sharing your story. I'm actually dealing with a situation that has some similarities to what you experienced, and I was wondering if you might have time for a brief conversation. We found a quiet corner of the conference center, and Amanda described her situation. Her direct supervisor, a man named Brandon Walsh, had been systematically taking credit for her work on major client accounts, while simultaneously undermining her reputation with senior management through subtle but persistent negative comments about her, quote, communication style and team collaboration skills. It sounds familiar, I said. What evidence do you have of what's happening? That's the problem. Brandon is very careful about how he operates. He never puts anything in writing, and he's skilled at making his sabotage look like legitimate feedback or coincidental oversights. Amanda's situation was more subtle than what I'd faced with Richard, but potentially more dangerous because of its sophistication. Brandon wasn't planning a dramatic sabotage. He was executing a slow-burn campaign to systematically destroy her credibility and claim ownership of her achievements. The challenge with this kind of workplace sabotage, I told Amanda, is that it's designed to be invisible until it's too late. By the time you realize what's happening, your reputation has been damaged, and your saboteur has positioned himself as your replacement. So what do you recommend? I spent the next 45 minutes walking Amanda through a strategic framework I'd developed for responding to workplace sabotage. The methodology had grown out of my own experience, but had been refined through my work with other professionals who'd faced similar challenges. First, you need to document everything, I explained. Every meeting, every conversation, every project milestone. Create a paper trail that establishes your contributions and timeline your achievements relative to Brandon's claims. Second, you need to build strategic alliances with key stakeholders. Brandon's power comes from controlling the narrative about your work. You need to create direct relationships with senior managers and clients that bypass his filter. Third, you need to position yourself proactively rather than just defending against his attacks. Don't just prove that you're not what he says you are. Demonstrate capabilities that go beyond what he's capable of understanding or claiming. Amanda took notes furiously as I outlined specific tactics for each phase of the strategy. By the time we finished talking, she had a comprehensive plan for not just surviving Brandon's sabotage, but potentially exposing him and advancing her own career in the process. This is incredibly helpful, Amanda said. Have you considered writing a book about this? I think there are a lot of people who could benefit from this framework. The idea hadn't occurred to me, but as I thought about it, I realized Amanda was right. My experience with Richard had taught me lessons that could help countless other professionals who found themselves targets of workplace sabotage. 6 months later, my book, Strategic Response: Turning Workplace Sabotage into Career Advancement, was published by Harvard Business Review Press. The book combined my personal story with research on workplace dynamics, strategic thinking frameworks, and case studies from other professionals who'd successfully overcome similar challenges. The book became a bestseller in the business leadership category, and more importantly, it sparked a broader conversation about the prevalence of workplace sabotage and the need for strategic rather than reactive responses to professional threats. But perhaps the most satisfying development came 2 years after the book's publication, when I received a call from Amanda Foster. Jessica, I wanted to update you on how everything worked out with Brandon, Amanda said, excitement clear in her voice. I'm listening. I followed your strategic framework exactly. I documented everything, built direct relationships with senior management, and positioned myself as a strategic asset rather than just defending against his attacks. Amanda went on to describe how her proactive approach had not only protected her from Brandon's sabotage, but had actually accelerated her career advancement. She'd been promoted to senior marketing director, while Brandon had been transferred to a less influential role after his pattern of taking credit for others' work became apparent to senior management. But here's the best part, Amanda continued. I've now used your framework to help 3 other colleagues who were dealing with similar situations. It's become sort of an informal network of people who know how to respond strategically to workplace sabotage. The idea of an informal network of strategically minded professionals was intriguing. It suggested that the lessons from my experience with Richard had grown beyond my individual situation into something that could help create more ethical and merit-based workplace cultures. This realization led to my next venture, founding the Strategic Leadership Institute, a consulting firm that helps organizations identify and address toxic workplace dynamics while teaching individual professionals how to respond strategically to professional threats. The Institute has worked with Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations to create cultures where merit and integrity are rewarded, rather than manipulation and sabotage. We've developed assessment tools for identifying potential saboteurs during the hiring process, training programs for managers on recognizing and addressing toxic behaviors, and strategic response frameworks for individuals who find themselves targeted by workplace predators. The work has been incredibly fulfilling because it addresses the root causes of the problems I experienced, rather than just helping individuals respond to them after the fact. We're actually changing workplace cultures to make Richard Kellerman-style sabotage less likely to occur and less likely to succeed when it does happen. Last month, I received perhaps the most unexpected and meaningful validation of this work. I was in my office at the Strategic Leadership Institute when my assistant announced that I had a visitor who'd requested a few minutes of my time. It was Sarah Chen, the facilities coordinator who'd helped Richard execute his sabotage plan 4 years earlier. Sarah looked nervous but determined as she entered my office. She'd clearly spent time preparing for this conversation. "Jessica, thank you for seeing me. I know I have no right to ask for your time, especially given my role in what Richard tried to do to you." "Have a seat, Sarah. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to tell you about what's happened since everything fell apart, and to ask for your advice about something important." Sarah explained that she'd been fired from Meridian Marketing immediately after Richard's arrest, and had spent months struggling to find employment because of her involvement in the conspiracy. Eventually, she'd found work as an administrative assistant at a small consulting firm, but the experience had forced her to confront her own role in workplace toxicity. "I spent a lot of time thinking about why I agreed to help Richard," Sarah said. "I convinced myself that it was just about getting a promotion, but the truth is that I was attracted to the idea of being part of something that felt powerful, even if it was wrong." Sarah's honesty was refreshing, and I found myself genuinely interested in her perspective on the events that had shaped both our lives. "What I've realized," Sarah continued, "is that there are probably a lot of people like me in workplaces everywhere, people who aren't naturally predators like Richard, but who get drawn into toxic behaviors because they feel powerless or overlooked in legitimate ways." She was describing exactly the kind of systemic issue that the Strategic Leadership Institute was designed to address. "I've been following your work with the Institute," Sarah said, "and I wondered if there might be a role for someone like me in what you're doing. Someone who understands how good people can get drawn into bad situations and who could help develop programs to prevent that from happening." The request was surprising, but as I thought about it, I realized Sarah might be exactly the kind of perspective we needed. Our work had focused primarily on helping victims of workplace sabotage and training managers to recognize toxic behaviors. But we hadn't developed comprehensive programs for people who'd participated in workplace toxicity and wanted to change. "Sarah, tell me more about what you're thinking." "I believe there are a lot of people in organizations who participate in toxic behaviors not because they're inherently bad people, but because they feel like they don't have other options for advancement or recognition. If we could identify those people and give them alternative pathways to success, we might be able to prevent a lot of workplace sabotage before it starts." Sarah's insight was profound. She was describing an approach to organizational change that addressed the supply side of workplace toxicity, rather than just the demand side. "I'd like to develop training programs for employees who've been involved in toxic workplace behaviors, either as perpetrators or as accomplices," Sarah continued. "Programs that help them understand why they made those choices and give them skills for advancing their careers through legitimate means." The more Sarah talked, the more I realized that her perspective could be invaluable for the Institute's work. She understood the psychology of workplace sabotage from the inside, and she'd lived through the consequences of those choices in a way that could inform our prevention strategies. Sarah, I think you're onto something important. Would you be interested in developing a pilot program around these ideas? Her face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm I remembered from my early days building the Morrison Industries partnership. I would love that opportunity, Jessica, and I want you to know that if this works out, it would represent a kind of redemption I never thought would be possible. 3 months later, Sarah launched the Institute's Ethical Leadership Transition Program, designed specifically for employees who'd participated in workplace toxicity and wanted to develop more ethical approaches to career advancement. The program combined psychological counseling, skills training, and mentorship to help participants understand their past choices and develop healthier professional strategies. The program's success exceeded our expectations. Participants reported not only changes in their own behavior, but improvements in the overall culture of their workplaces, as former saboteurs became advocates for ethical leadership practices. As I reflect on the 4-year journey from Richard's failed sabotage attempt to the creation of a thriving institute dedicated to ethical leadership, I'm struck by how completely the narrative has transformed. What began as a story about workplace revenge has evolved into something much larger, a story about how individual integrity and strategic thinking can create systemic change that benefits entire organizations and communities. Richard Kellerman tried to make my career take a fall, but instead launched me on a trajectory that has allowed me to help thousands of other professionals navigate workplace challenges with integrity and strategic wisdom. His criminal conspiracy became the catalyst for work that is making workplaces more ethical and merit-based across multiple industries. The ultimate irony is that Richard's attempt to sabotage me ended up creating more positive impact than either of us could have imagined. His failure to destroy me became the foundation for success that continues to grow and evolve in ways I'm still discovering. Sometimes the best revenge really is building something so meaningful and impactful that your enemy's attacks become the origin story of your greatest achievements. 5 years after founding the Strategic Leadership Institute, I found myself facing an unexpected challenge that would test everything I'd learned about strategic thinking and ethical leadership. The challenge came in the form of a phone call from David Park, my former COO at Meridian Marketing. Jessica, I hope you have time to discuss something urgent. We're facing a situation that could destroy everything we've built at Meridian, and frankly, you're the only person I know with the strategic expertise to help us navigate it. David went on to explain that Meridian Marketing was being targeted by a coordinated attack from a competitor, Nexus Strategic, a larger agency that had been systematically poaching Meridian's clients through what appeared to be industrial espionage and deliberate sabotage. They somehow obtained confidential information about our client proposals, our pricing strategies, and our internal communications. They're using this information to undercut our bids and spread rumors about our financial stability, David said. How long has this been going on? I asked. We first noticed unusual patterns about 6 months ago, but it's escalated dramatically in the past 2 months. We've lost 4 major clients, and 3 more are considering terminating their contracts. If this continues, we might have to close the agency. The situation David described was corporate sabotage on a scale that made Richard Kellerman's individual conspiracy look amateurish by comparison. But as I listened to the details, I realized that many of the strategic principles I'd developed for responding to workplace sabotage could be scaled up to address this enterprise-level threat. David, I'd like to help, but I need to understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. Can you send me all the documentation you have about these incidents? Already prepared. I'll have everything for you within the hour. That evening, I spent 4 hours reviewing the evidence David had compiled. The pattern that emerged was sophisticated and methodical. Nexus Strategic wasn't just competing aggressively, they were systematically undermining Meridian's reputation, stealing confidential information, and spreading disinformation designed to damage client relationships. But as I analyzed their tactics, I began to see vulnerabilities in their approach. Nexus was making the same fundamental mistake that Richard had made years earlier. They were underestimating their target's ability to respond strategically. The next morning, I called David back with a proposal. I'm willing to help Meridian respond to this threat, but I want to do it through the Strategic Leadership Institute. This situation could become a powerful case study for how organizations can respond to systematic corporate sabotage. What do you have in mind? I want to document everything we do, from investigation to response to resolution. If we can successfully counter Nexus's attack, the methodology we develop could help other organizations facing similar threats. David agreed immediately, and within a week I had assembled a team of investigators, strategic communications experts, and legal professionals to begin what we called Operation Integrity Shield. The investigation phase revealed the stunning scope of Nexus's operation. They had planted an employee inside Meridian's IT department, who was systematically copying confidential files and transmitting them to Nexus leadership. They had hired private investigators to surveil Meridian executives and gather intelligence about their personal and professional vulnerabilities. Most damaging of all, they had created a network of fake industry sources who were spreading rumors about Meridian's financial stability and client satisfaction rates. "This is industrial espionage on a criminal level," said Elena Rodriguez, the former FBI investigator I'd brought in to lead the evidence gathering. "What Nexus is doing violates multiple federal laws related to corporate espionage, wire fraud, and conspiracy. But rather than simply turning the evidence over to law enforcement, I decided to apply the strategic framework I'd developed years earlier. Simply stopping Nexus's attack wouldn't be enough. We needed to ensure they faced comprehensive consequences while positioning Meridian for long-term competitive advantage. The counter strategy we developed operated on 3 levels simultaneously. First, we worked with law enforcement to build a criminal case against Nexus's leadership. Second, we launched a civil lawsuit seeking damages and injunctive relief. Third, and most importantly, we executed a strategic communications campaign that turned Nexus's attack into a demonstration of Meridian's superior crisis management capabilities. The communications campaign was perhaps the most creative aspect of our response. Instead of simply defending against Nexus's attacks, we proactively shared the story of what was happening with industry media, positioning Meridian as a victim of corporate espionage who was responding with transparency and integrity. The key insight, I explained to David and his team, is that being the target of sophisticated corporate sabotage actually demonstrates your competitive value. Companies don't go to these lengths to attack irrelevant competitors. We documented every aspect of Nexus's attack and our response, creating a real-time case study that captured the attention of business schools, industry associations, and corporate executives nationwide. The story became a cautionary tale about the risks of unethical competitive practices while simultaneously showcasing Meridian's crisis management expertise. The results exceeded our most optimistic projections. Within 3 months, not only had we stopped Nexus's attack, but we had turned the situation into the biggest business development opportunity in Meridian's history. Companies across multiple industries began reaching out to Meridian specifically because they wanted to work with an agency that had demonstrated such sophisticated crisis management capabilities. "It's remarkable," Patricia Hammond told me during one of our strategy sessions. "Nexus tried to destroy us, but instead they've made us the most sought-after crisis management consultancy on the West Coast." The legal resolution was equally satisfying. Nexus Strategic's CEO and 2 senior executives were criminally charged with corporate espionage and conspiracy. The company was forced to pay Meridian $8 million in damages and publicly apologize for their illegal tactics. Most importantly, the case established legal precedents that would make similar attacks more difficult for other companies to execute. But the most significant long-term impact came from the methodology we developed during Operation Integrity Shield. The Strategic Leadership Institute's Enterprise Defense Framework became the gold standard for how organizations should respond to systematic corporate sabotage. The framework was based on 5 core principles: comprehensive documentation, strategic alliance building, legal preparation, communications leadership, and transformative positioning. Each principle addressed a different aspect of corporate defense while creating opportunities for competitive advantage. 6 months after the Nexus case concluded, I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee on corporate espionage. The hearing was designed to understand how companies could better protect themselves against industrial sabotage while maintaining competitive marketplace dynamics. "Ms. Martinez," said Congressman Michael Stevens, the subcommittee chairman, "your work on the Meridian marketing case has been described as a textbook example of how companies should respond to corporate espionage. What lessons do you think other organizations can learn from this experience? Congressman, the most important lesson is that defensive strategies alone are insufficient when facing systematic corporate sabotage. Organizations need to think strategically about how to transform attacks into opportunities for competitive advantage. I went on to explain how companies could build resilience against corporate espionage while simultaneously using such attacks to demonstrate their crisis management capabilities and ethical leadership principles. The paradox of corporate sabotage, I told the subcommittee, is that it often reveals more about the attacker's weaknesses than the target's vulnerabilities. Companies that respond strategically can emerge from these situations stronger and more competitive than before. My testimony was covered extensively in business media, and it led to consulting opportunities with companies across multiple industries who wanted to implement similar defensive strategies. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. 2 years after my congressional testimony, I received a letter from Brandon Walsh, the marketing manager who had been systematically sabotaging Amanda Foster when she first approached me for advice. The letter was handwritten and clearly represented significant personal reflection. Dear Ms. Martinez, you don't know me, but my name is Brandon Walsh. 2 years ago, I was engaged in workplace behavior that was similar to what Richard Kellerman tried to do to you. I was systematically undermining a colleague named Amanda Foster, taking credit for her work and trying to damage her reputation with senior management. Amanda never told me that she had spoken with you about the situation, but she implemented a strategic response that not only protected her from my attacks, but also exposed my behavior to senior management. I was transferred to a different role, and Amanda was promoted to the position I had been trying to claim for myself. I spent months feeling angry and resentful about what had happened, convinced that Amanda had somehow manipulated the situation unfairly. But eventually, I was forced to confront the reality that my behavior had been unethical and destructive. I ended up reading your book and learning about the Strategic Leadership Institute's work. For the first time, I understood the full scope of what I had been doing and why it was so damaging. Not just to Amanda, but to myself and to the organization. I wanted you to know that I've spent the past year working with a therapist to understand why I had chosen manipulation over merit as a career strategy. I've also enrolled in the Institute's Ethical Leadership Transition Program that Sarah Chen developed. Program has been transformative for me. I've learned how to advance my career through legitimate achievements rather than undermining others. More importantly, I've developed skills for recognizing and countering toxic workplace behaviors when I encounter them. I'm writing to thank you for creating frameworks that don't just help victims of workplace sabotage but also help people like me who had become perpetrators of it. Your work has given me a path toward redemption that I didn't think was possible. I hope you'll continue developing programs that address both sides of workplace toxicity. There are a lot of people like me who need help finding better ways to pursue professional success. Sincerely, Brandon Walsh. Brandon's letter represented something I hadn't fully appreciated about the Institute's work. We weren't just helping victims of workplace sabotage. We were creating pathways for reforming the people who engaged in such behavior. This realization led to the Institute's most ambitious project yet, the National Workplace Integrity Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to address toxic workplace cultures at the systemic level. The initiative works with organizations to identify cultural factors that enable workplace sabotage, develop prevention strategies, and create support systems for both victims and perpetrators of toxic behaviors. We've partnered with universities to integrate ethical leadership training into business school curricula, and we've worked with government agencies to develop policy frameworks that encourage corporate integrity. Last month, the initiative achieved a milestone that would have seemed impossible when I first overheard Richard Kellerman planning to sabotage me 8 years ago. We were awarded a $50 million federal grant to establish the National Center for Workplace Integrity, a research and training institute that will work with organizations nationwide to create more ethical and merit-based workplace cultures. The center will be housed at the University of Washington, just a few miles from the Meridian Marketing Building where this entire journey began. As I stood in the university's business school last week, signing the partnership agreement that will establish the center, I couldn't help but think about the incredible journey that had brought me to this moment. 8 years ago, I was a senior account manager preparing for what I thought would be the biggest presentation of my career. I had no idea that my supervisor's criminal conspiracy would launch me on a trajectory that would ultimately impact workplace cultures across the entire country. Richard Kellerman had tried to make my career take a fall, but instead had provided the catalyst for work that will help create more ethical workplaces for generations of professionals who will never know his name or mine. The true measure of strategic revenge, I've learned, isn't the destruction of your enemies. It's the creation of something so positive and impactful that their attacks become footnotes in a much larger story of progress and transformation. As I walked across the university campus that evening, thinking about the center's potential to influence workplace cultures nationwide, I realized that Richard's failed sabotage attempt had taught me the most important lesson of my professional life. When someone tries to destroy you, you have the opportunity to build something that makes their destruction irrelevant. The best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting so far ahead that your enemies become part of your origin story rather than obstacles to your success. 10 years after Richard Kellerman's failed sabotage attempt, I found myself in Geneva, Switzerland, addressing the World Economic Forum on the topic of transforming global workplace culture through strategic leadership. The auditorium was filled with CEOs, government ministers, and thought leaders from around the world, all gathered to discuss how the principles I'd developed could be applied to workplace challenges across different cultures and economic systems. When we talk about workplace integrity, I told the international audience, we're not just discussing individual ethical choices. We're talking about fundamental economic competitiveness. Countries and companies that create cultures of merit and strategic thinking will consistently outperform those that tolerate sabotage and manipulation. The presentation included data from the National Center for Workplace Integrity, showing how organizations that implemented our frameworks saw average productivity increases of 37% and employee retention improvements of over 50%. But more importantly, we documented how these cultural changes were creating measurable economic benefits at the regional and national level. After my presentation, I was approached by Dr. Kenji Tanaka, Japan's Minister of Economic Development, who had been following our work through academic publications and international business journals. Ms. Martinez, your research has profound implications for how we think about national economic competitiveness. Would you be interested in consulting with the Japanese government on implementing these principles across our major corporations? The conversation with Dr. Tanaka led to the most ambitious project in the Strategic Leadership Institute's history, the Global Workplace Transformation Initiative, a collaboration with governments and multinational corporations to implement ethical leadership frameworks across entire economic sectors. The Japanese pilot program became our proof of concept. Working with 12 major corporations, we implemented comprehensive workplace integrity systems that addressed everything from hiring practices to performance evaluation to crisis response protocols. The results were extraordinary. Participating companies saw innovation rates increase by an average of 45%, while experiencing dramatic reductions in internal conflicts and employee turnover. But the real breakthrough came when we discovered something unexpected in the data. Companies that had successfully transformed their workplace cultures weren't just performing better internally, they were becoming more effective at international collaboration and cross-cultural business development. What we're seeing, explained Dr. Sarah Kim, our lead researcher who had joined the Institute after completing her PhD in organizational psychology, is that ethical leadership principles create a foundation for trust that transcends cultural and linguistic barriers. Companies with strong integrity cultures are naturally better at forming strategic partnerships and navigating complex international business relationships. This insight led to an invitation that would change everything. The European Union asked us to develop a comprehensive framework for ethical business practices that could be implemented across all member countries. The EU project was massive in scope, working with hundreds of companies across 27 countries to develop culturally sensitive implementations of strategic leadership principles. But it also provided an opportunity to test our theories about workplace integrity at an unprecedented scale. The initial results were promising, but it was during the implementation phase that we encountered our most significant challenge yet. A consortium of consulting firms that had been profiting from toxic workplace cultures began a coordinated campaign to discredit our work and undermine the EU initiative. The attack was sophisticated and international in scope. Led by a London-based firm called Sterling Advisory Group, the consortium used media manipulation, academic criticism, and political lobbying to characterize our work as naive idealism that would damage European economic competitiveness. They're essentially arguing that ethical leadership is a luxury that businesses can't afford in a competitive global economy, explained Elena Rodriguez, who had left the FBI to become our Director of Strategic Security. It's the same logic that Richard Kellerman used, that success requires cutting corners and exploiting others. But this time, I had resources and experience that I'd lacked during my original confrontation with Richard. More importantly, I had a team of brilliant professionals who understood strategic thinking at the highest levels. Elena, I want you to investigate Sterling Advisory Group the same way we investigated Nexus Strategic, I said. But this time, we're not just defending one company, we're defending a fundamental principle about how business should operate in the 21st century. The investigation revealed that Sterling Advisory Group was funded by a network of corporations that had built their competitive strategies around exploiting regulatory gaps, manipulating employees, and engaging in the kind of systematic sabotage we'd been working to eliminate. These aren't legitimate competitors with different philosophical approaches, Elena reported. These are companies whose entire business model depends on maintaining toxic workplace cultures. They're attacking us because our success threatens their ability to profit from organizational dysfunction. The counter-strategy we developed was the most comprehensive corporate response in the Institute's history. Working with EU regulatory authorities, international media organizations, and academic researchers, we launched what we called Operation Transparency, a systematic exposure of how Sterling's client companies operated and the economic costs of their toxic practices. The campaign included detailed case studies showing how companies that embraced ethical leadership consistently outperformed those that relied on manipulation and sabotage. We published research demonstrating the macroeconomic benefits of workplace integrity, and we created media content that told the human stories behind the statistics. But the most powerful element of our response came from an unexpected source. Employees within Sterling's client companies began reaching out to us with evidence of the toxic practices they'd been forced to participate in. "We've created something we didn't anticipate," I told my leadership team during one of our strategy sessions. "We've built a movement of people who understand that there's a better way to do business, and they're willing to take risks to make it happen." The whistleblowers provided documentation of systematic wage theft, deliberate psychological manipulation of employees, and coordinated efforts to suppress worker organization and advocacy. More importantly, they provided evidence that Sterling Advisory Group had been teaching these practices as deliberate business strategies. The exposure of Sterling's practices created an international scandal that ultimately led to criminal investigations in multiple countries. Several of their client companies faced significant legal penalties, and Sterling itself was forced to close its operations in the EU. But the real victory wasn't the destruction of our opponents. It was the validation of our core principle that ethical leadership creates sustainable, competitive advantage. The EU initiative expanded from a pilot program to a mandatory framework for all companies doing business within the European Union. "What you've accomplished here," said Dr. Angela Merkel, the former German chancellor who had become an advocate for our work, "is fundamentally changing how we think about the relationship between ethics and economics. You've proven that moral leadership isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do." The success of the EU initiative led to similar programs in Canada, Australia, and South Korea. Within 2 years, we were working with governments and corporations on every continent to implement workplace integrity frameworks that were measurably improving both economic performance and employee well-being. But perhaps the most meaningful development came from a completely unexpected direction. 5 years after the Sterling Advisory Group scandal, I received a video call request from someone I hadn't heard from in over a decade, Richard Kellerman. Richard looked completely different from the broken man who had visited my office years earlier. He appeared healthy, confident, and genuinely at peace with himself. He was calling from the office of the nonprofit organization where he now served as executive director. "Jessica, I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I've been following your work with the Global Workplace Transformation Initiative, and I wanted to share something with you that I think you'll find interesting." Richard went on to explain that his nonprofit had been selected to participate in a pilot program testing our workplace integrity frameworks within the social services sector. The results had been transformative, not just for the organization's effectiveness, but for Richard personally. Working within an ethical leadership framework has taught me capabilities I never developed during my corporate career, Richard said. For the first time in my professional life, I'm advancing based on genuine contributions rather than political maneuvering or taking credit for others' work. But Richard's call wasn't just about personal updates. He had a proposal that would bring our story full circle in a way I never could have imagined. Jessica, I've been thinking about something for the past year. Your work has helped millions of people create better workplace cultures. But there's one audience that might benefit from hearing directly from someone who used to be part of the problem. Richard's idea was both simple and powerful. He wanted to create a speaker series where former workplace saboteurs would share their stories alongside the people they had targeted, demonstrating both the destructive nature of toxic behaviors and the possibility of redemption and transformation. I think there's incredible power in having perpetrators and victims appear together to tell the complete story, Richard explained. It would show people that workplace toxicity isn't inevitable, and that even the worst behaviors can be changed through the right frameworks and support systems. The idea resonated with everything we'd learned about sustainable cultural change. Real transformation required addressing both sides of workplace dysfunction, helping victims develop strategic responses while providing pathways for perpetrators to change their behaviors. 3 months later, Richard and I appeared together at the Harvard Business School, delivering a joint presentation to 300 MBA students about the long-term consequences of workplace sabotage and the strategic principles that could prevent and address such behaviors. 10 years ago, I tried to destroy Jessica's career through criminal conspiracy, Richard told the audience. I failed spectacularly, and she not only survived my attack, but used it as the foundation for work that has transformed workplace cultures worldwide. I followed by explaining how the strategic thinking framework I developed in response to Richard's sabotage had evolved into principles that were now being implemented by organizations across the globe. The most important lesson from our story, I told the students, isn't about workplace revenge or even strategic response to adversity. It's about the power of ethical leadership to create sustainable competitive advantage and meaningful positive change. The presentation was recorded and became one of Harvard Business School's most viewed case study videos. More importantly, it inspired similar collaborations between former saboteurs and their targets at business schools and corporate training programs worldwide. But the ultimate validation of our work came through recognition I never could have imagined when I first overheard Richard planning to sabotage me 12 years earlier. Last month, I was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for my contribution to, quote, creating frameworks for ethical leadership that have measurably reduced workplace conflict and economic inequality worldwide. Standing on the stage in Oslo, Norway, looking out at an audience that included world leaders, Nobel laureates, and representatives from every continent, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment. 12 years ago, I said during my acceptance speech, I was the target of a criminal conspiracy designed to destroy my career and steal my work. The person who attacked me believed that success required undermining others and taking credit for achievements he hadn't earned. I paused, seeing Richard in the audience, where he sat with Margaret and their 2 children, all of them beaming with pride at how far we'd both traveled from that dark moment in the Meridian marketing hallway. But what that person didn't understand, and what I've spent the past decade proving, is that ethical leadership creates opportunities that manipulation and sabotage can never achieve. When you build your success on integrity, strategic thinking, and genuine contribution, you create value that benefits not just yourself, but everyone around you. The speech concluded with a principle that had become the foundation of everything the Strategic Leadership Institute represented. The best response to those who try to tear you down isn't to destroy them in return. It's to build something so positive and powerful that their attacks become the origin story of your greatest contributions to the world. As I left the stage in Oslo, holding the Nobel Peace Prize that represented recognition for work that had started as a response to one man's petty attempt at workplace sabotage, I realized that Richard Kellerman had unknowingly given me the greatest gift possible, the opportunity to discover what I was truly capable of achieving when I combined strategic thinking with unwavering ethical principles. His attempt to make my career fall had instead launched me toward heights neither of us had ever imagined possible. And in the end, that might be the most perfect revenge of all, transforming someone's attempt to destroy you into the foundation for making the world a better place. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.